Okay, in this video, we are going to map Joyner's argument from the podcast together. And by together, I mean you should open up MindMap and follow along to create your own argument map. And it should look basically just like mine. To create a new argument map, hopefully in a dedicated folder for this class, go to New, just like you would to open a new Google Doc, but go down to More, and then to MindMap. And pop quiz, what's the first thing you should do when you open a new MindMap file? Remember, blue is bad. Go to View, start Argument Visualization. And also turn on autosave. And if you ever forget this step and somehow lose your work, if you reopen the file and it's blank, but then you click turn on autosave, your work will usually magically reappear. Okay, let's give it a title. And let's get started. So this is a longer argument. What is our goal? It is not to capture every sentence of the argument and fit it into a map. It is to illuminate the argument, to make it as clear as possible what the main claim is, what the evidence is, and how everything fits together. We were really specific in the exercises where we wanted to get every sentence in, but that's because we were just practicing how to map. What we want to do is really just illuminate the structure of the argument here. And because it's longer, I'm going to start by sketching in the broadest structure and then filling in details. So to do that, I have identified three major parts of the argument, and I've copied and pasted the bits of the transcript for each of those parts. So I've labeled the parts: Part 1, consult a dictionary. Part 2, think it through, right? I kind of tried to think through what I thought a soup needed to be. Part 3, consult common opinion, or jargon word. Use this criterion, consensus gentium, the criterion, what do people think, in order to establish what is true. What do each of those three chunks have in common? They are all strategies for getting to the conclusion that cereal is not soup. Right, there's the consult a dictionary strategy. There's the think it through strategy. And there's the consult common opinion strategy. Now, this is just my sketch of the argument. When I'm done, anything that's in a box should be a complete sentence. Each thing in a box should be a claim, the kind of thing that's true or false. It shouldn't just be keywords. But I'm just trying to sketch in a structure and then go back and add the details, including complete sentences. Okay, so my next question is, where does the author actually stand on these lines of argument, right? She presents three attempts to argue that cereal is not soup. And I would say there are three independent attempts, right? Each one on its own supports the conclusion. Indeed, they're kind of actually, in some sense, not consistent with one another. For example, if common opinion determines, not just as a good guide to, but determines whether or not cereal is a soup, then whether or not cereal is a soup depends. It depends on what people happen to think. Like, maybe it's not soup because people don't think so, but in theory it could be. Whereas if you're taking the think it through strategy and your goal is to find the essential feature of soup such that cereal doesn't have that feature, then probably you mean cereal isn't soup in fact, and also in theory. There is no it could be, it isn't, and we'll find the correct set of properties to draw the distinction. So these actually might end up with slightly different conclusions. But they're three independent, they don't need each other in order to provide their bit of support. let's do a super quick review of independent versus co-premises, especially since we just finished the argument mapping modules and many people are still feeling a little shaky about the difference. What does it mean to say that two premises, or here we're kind of looking at lines of argument, are independent of one another? Obviously, the more independent premises that you have, right, each one is adding some support such that they, in some sense, clearly work together. 4 premises, unless one of them is completely irrelevant, is usually better than 1 premise. They clearly work together. What makes them independent is that they don't need the other 3 in order for them to provide their bit of support. So, for example, if it turns out this line of argument doesn't work, this one still could. That is not the case with co-premises. If our premises are co-premises, and there could be more than one, but let's keep it simple and just stick to 2, which is usually the case. The premises need each other in order to provide support for the conclusion. If you take one away, if it turns out this one is false, this one on its own no longer provides the same amount of support it did before. It's only when you have both. So what would a co-premise be in this case? Well, we don't even have complete sentences here, so let's set it up so we do have complete sentences. What would be a premise that has to do with the dictionary that supports the claim cereal is not soup? All right, and let's Google it quick. Consult a dictionary, the Dictionary of Oxford Languages, not Merriam-Webster in our case, but looks pretty close. And let's add a co-premise. How does the dictionary support this conclusion? What must we additionally assume? And let's remove our objection for now. What must we be additionally assuming in order for this to provide its bit of support? Imagine somebody says, so what? How does that show us that cereal isn't soup? We might say something like, well, cereal is not made by Okay, so these are clearly co-premises. It's not the case that one gives us a reason to believe the other. The fact that cereal isn't made by doesn't give us a reason to believe that's the definition of soup. And they're not independent, as in this doesn't support cereal not being a soup unless we are assuming that this is true. But even more, there's another assumption that's pretty important here, which is right? So when we have these 3 things in place, that gives us an argument for the claim that cereal is not soup. It might not be an exceptionless argument. It may be possible to say, even if those things are true, the conclusion still doesn't follow. And to express that point, we could put an objection here. But we're not evaluating the argument. We are trying to capture the argument we have been given. And the strategy is look at what the dictionary definition says, assuming that it's a good guide to answering the question. And this is the set of claims you would need to have in place in order to make this argument. Now, this one is never actually stated, but it's obvious that cereal is not made by boiling meat, fish, or vegetables, right? Okay, so we have an argument. We have co-premises. Better together. It's not just they each add extra support. It's only if we have all three. Do any of them provide any support for the conclusion? That's what makes them co-premises. We'll want to do something similar for each of the other lines of argument. But before we do, let's add in what Joyner says. What does Joyner think of this argument? Okay, she says, well, it's the obvious place to start. What's the definition anyway? Her strategy is assume the dictionary answers this question for us, look in the dictionary to find out what soup is, and then show that cereal doesn't fit it. That's a strategy for an argument. And she finds some definitions, only one of which is actually relevant to answering the question, and the rest are more for, I don't know, fun, entertainment. We've got our definition. We could easily replace this with the one I just found in the argument. In fact, it would be better since we're mapping her argument. This definition doesn't help me at all because a liquid food, especially with these features, doesn't semantically eliminate soups that don't contain these things because of the word especially, right? So how do we capture that objection in this argument? What would it mean to put an objection here? To put an objection under a box is a not so type of objection. Whenever you put an objection under a box, you're saying, here's a reason to think this is not true. Is she objecting that this is what the dictionary said, to the claim that this is what the dictionary says? No, there's no objection to this is what the dictionary actually says. Is she objecting to cereal not being made by boiling meat, fish, or vegetables? No, clearly it's not. Is she objecting to this? Not yet. Not in the first part of the argument, though skipping ahead because we have listened to it. She asked the question leading into part 3, who decides what things mean in the first place? The host says, me and the dictionary. And she says, that's where I disagree with you. What I've come to learn is that writers of the dictionary are not arbiters of truth. And so in part 3, we do get an objection to this. But that's not the complaint in part 1. The complaint in part 1 is the word typically. And so instead, let's object to the bar. When we put an objection here, we are saying not that a box is false, we are saying so what follows, right? This is a so what follows. Not the conclusion. We're objecting to the reasoning. That is to say, yes, that's the definition. True, cereal is not made by these things. And assume dictionaries are relevant. My issue is that the word typically doesn't mean cereal is excluded. Cereal could just be an atypical soup, one that's not made by boiling meat, fish, or vegetables. what are some examples? She doesn't go into it in this section, but what are some examples of soups that aren't made by boiling meat or fish or vegetables in a stock or a water? Why is there a typically in the dictionary definition? You might look that up. Okay, at this point, what I want to do is use the node style option. How did I get there? I'm right-clicking on the box, node style. It is also up in the ribbon. And I'm going to change the background color for some of the boxes in order to distinguish between arguments that are just like, here's how an argument could go, and claims Joyner actually stands by. Now, as you can see, this is a horrifically ugly palette of colors. So instead, I'm going to choose a color that I think looks nice, like lemon chiffon. And I'm going to make all of the boxes that aren't part of the argument Joyner actually ends up accepting a separate color. So now I know that anything that's a plain colored box is Joyner's claim. Okay, so this is basically the argument in the first section. And we could go further here. Like we could explain the definition only identifies typical ingredients or components of soups. And this is actually two claims, so we could make it co-premises. It's true that here's a claim about the definition, and cereal could be an atypical soup, but I don't think that helps us to understand the argument any better. Keep it a little simpler. Okay, and I'm also going to give this a little label, right? This is number 1, the dictionary strategy, or whatever you want to call it, as long as it's sort of helpful. Now, you can collapse and expand parts of your argument. You can collapse and expand a little bit like this. If you click on a box that has some bits under it and use the letter F, just the plain letter F, not like a function key or anything, that expands a box. And if you want to expand a whole chunk like this, click on the bit under the bar and do the same thing, and it'll collapse the whole branch. Okay, let's move on to thinking it through. Again, we want to make this more detailed and we want to use complete sentences. How does this line of argument go? Okay, so as is often the case, it's nice when the beginning of a section of a paper or argument has a little intro of its own that includes the conclusion. Knowing what the conclusion in it is in advance can help you make sense of the argument that comes. Right, so transition, because those definitions didn't help, I kind of tried to think through what a soup needed to be. And once you do that, you really start to get into some trouble, because the fact of the matter is there are legitimate soups of every kind, temperature, served at every time of the day with whatever contents, and that effectively open the door for cereal to walk into the soup category. That's the conclusion we're going to get to. There is no set of properties that soup has that categorically eliminates cereal from the soup category. Why? Because there are legitimate soups of all features we could come up with. So let's sketch that bit in. I'm not quite sure how the argument's going to go, so I'm going to set it aside for now and just map this little bit here. Which actually is really just a claim. I thought I selected a bit of text that had some reasoning in it. That's just a claim. There are legitimate soups of every kind What does that have to do with cereal not being a soup? Is the thing we want to sketch in over here. But for now, let's just start with this claim and let's identify some more important pieces of the argument. So we've got assumptions, right? A soup should be served hot, or at least cooked hot. Whereas assumption number 2, it should be prepared hot even if it's served cold. Number 3, it's not a breakfast food. And number 4, it shouldn't be sweet. Okay, so here are the 3 assumptions that she ultimately argues against by citing examples of assumingly legitimate soups and comes to this conclusion. Okay, but we started setting this up as possible arguments for, with Joyner's voice being the objections. We could instead set it up differently. If you can think of ways to do it differently, there are others, but I'm just going to illustrate one way. So by think it through, I mean come up with these. So let's now I could put these all in a single box. Soup is served hot, it's not for breakfast, and it's not sweet. One box. And then add in the co-premise that we need here, which is that cereal is served cold for breakfast and it's very often sweet. Why split them up for soup but not for cereal? Well, because there are different objections to each of these, and so I split it up because it's capturing something that happens in the argument. So what's the objection to soup must be served hot? Gazpacho is not served hot. And what's the co-premise here? And gazpacho is a legitimate soup. Right? If we aren't assuming that this is true, then who cares how gazpacho is served? It's only if, and that's a legitimate soup. You have to have both. Right? Now, if we know it's a legitimate soup, it doesn't follow that soup must be served, or that it doesn't provide an objection to soup having to be served hot, unless we are assuming our background knowledge that gazpacho is not served hot. It is served cold. Okay, so another illustration of co-premises. Okay, likewise, it's not served for breakfast. Why don't you pause and fill in the 2 bits here on your own? Okay, here's what I came up with. So now I'm going to make these limoncello colored because this is the set of the author's claims. These are Joyner's claims. These are the hypothetical argument that she hoped would work but ultimately objects to. And notice I collapsed 2 of the 4 of the criteria into 1, or at least not prepared hot, and I didn't capture that down here. It's not served hot, and it's also not prepared hot, I don't think. And then also they argued that cereal is actually like baked in the factory, so in some sense it's prepared hot. But this seemed like a fairly minor point, and I might have even just left it off entirely. The point is, here are some criteria we might think are definitive of what a soup is. Cereal doesn't share them, thus cereal is not a soup. Now, of course, there is an implicit co-premise, an implicit assumption here. Sorry, I'm trying to get a co-premise box. Okay, and that assumption goes something like this. In order for this argument to make any sense, we have to be assuming that categories like soup are defined in terms of essential properties, kind of like the category triangle is defined in terms of essential properties. A triangle is a three-sided enclosed figure whose interior angles add up to 180 degrees. But for soup, these properties are physical components, right? Temperature, flavor. Well, guess not. Served for breakfast, not a physical component. So I take that back. And anything that doesn't have these essential properties is excluded from the category. So since it's never even kind of explicitly stated that that's the assumption of the argument, I'm going to make it dotted line. This is an advanced representation technique. Not a big deal if we don't do that. Okay, so there's the argument. The important part is this. Now, one could try to save this argument in a couple of ways. We could deny that these things are legit soups, or we can deny that these are the appropriate criteria and find better ones, ones that would exclude soup. Or we can accept that these are the appropriate criteria and include soup. Then we change the conclusion. But as is, this argument doesn't work for this. Let us give it a title. Number 2, the think it through strategy. And notice that we never actually used this sentence, which seemed like the conclusion. It is the takeaway point from all of these objections. The conclusion is really about this strategy of argument. This type of argument doesn't work because we came up with all of these. And so this points to, I'm going to close this up now. When you are critiquing arguments, there's usually more than one way to organize your map, and here are 2 really common ones, and it's worth making a note of this because it will come up again in this class. So I'm going to get rid of this. Here are 2 really common mapping strategies. Okay, assume we have a given argument. Either someone we're reading has made an argument, or we're hypothetically coming up with an argument to see if it works. So call this argument argument X. We could map that argument and then map what we have to say about the argument as objections to it, like we just did before. The other option is to just make our conclusion about the argument. In this case, you could say the think it through strategy doesn't work. Why? Because box I just erased, there are soups of every possible combination of properties you might think were distinctive of soup that would eliminate cereal. That wasn't a very clear sentence, but hopefully you know what I mean. So either one of these makes sense. Finally, we've mapped the 2 arguments Joyner doesn't accept. Let's start mapping the one she does, but I'm going to leave that to you as a short exercise, and it's totally okay if it's difficult. Don't spend too much time on it. Just do something that seems sensible in an efficient, short amount of time, like 10-15 minutes absolute max, and then just submit whatever you've got and compare it with the solution that I'll share with you. There's more than one good way to do it. There's a lot of wrong ways to do it. Just compare yours with how I did it when you are done. But let's get started. Okay, so again, I'm going to hide with the F key the 2 we're not working on, and the basic idea is to consult common opinion. Let's take a look at the text. Okay, we need to scroll down to this section, and let's start just by identifying some of the key bits of the argument. We already put this in the map. This is actually an objection to the original strategy of looking in the dictionary, but it is also relevant to her new strategy, which is consulting common opinion. And her whole point when she brings up the consensus gentium terminology is that there are a number of strategies for figuring out what's true, right? Theories about how to figure out what's true. One way of figuring out what's true might be to look at expert testimony, or another way of figuring out what's true might be to try to logically explain observations. Or a third way might be to consult common opinion. If everybody believes something, that could be some indication that the thing they all believe is true. So that's what the strategy is here. So let's create a pattern, a kind of generic pattern. Now, a consensus is rarely, literally everybody believes something, but most people, we use everyone. Everyone knows, everyone believes this. And we mean, actually, like most people, lots of people. And so call this a consensus gentium argument, or just an appeal to popular opinion, or an appeal to popularity, not like prom and voting for the prom king or whatever, but like what is popular, populace, people, what do most people believe? And the pattern is, here's a reason to think this is true. Most people think it's true. When is this a good pattern of reasoning? Because even before you encountered Joyner's acknowledgement that this is not always a good pattern of reasoning, surely you have someone like, just because people believe something doesn't mean it's true, right? People are often a poor guide to what's true. Are there specific cases where we should be suspect of everyone's believing something, where we would say like, yeah, everyone does believe that's true, but here's a good reason why we should think they might not be onto the truth? And are there cases where we think most people are onto the truth? The best explanation for why everyone believes a thing is that it's probably true. For example, let's say you go outside and you see all of your neighbors have their trash cans and recycling cans out. And you go, oh, I thought the recycling got picked up on Thursdays, but all the cans are out. I'm going to quick run inside and get my recycling and put it in the can. That's a case where I assume, well, the behavior is that, well, most people believe recycling is coming, the next morning because all the cans are out. And I think the best explanation for everyone doing this is they know something I don't. Maybe there was a change or I haven't been paying attention. Or maybe I know something they don't. Maybe it's usually this, but it's a holiday and there was a special memo, but I know that it wasn't like well distributed. And so maybe I know something they don't, in which case I wouldn't trust common opinion. But there are lots of cases where people are a really good guide to what's true. And I can say something about what kinds of cases those are. I think most people who are in charge of putting out the recycling know what day they have to do it. That's the kind of thing people are good at figuring out. So it's sometimes a perfectly legitimate thing to do. It's sometimes not. The question is, in this case, is it? But we're not evaluating this argument. We're just mapping it. And this is the style of argument we're giving. Most people think it's true, so it's true. So most people think cereal is not soup, so cereal is not soup. Now we also have to have a co-premise here. Actually, I'll rephrase this. And Joyner does give some reason to think both of these are true in the case of cereal is not soup. So X is cereal is not soup. Everyone thinks so, and what most people think is a good guide to what's true. Now there are more premises to add in, but if you go through and look at the transcript or whatever, maybe you have your own notes from the video, you should be able to fill in reasons for both of these things. Okay. Finish mapping that part of the argument on your own. Add it into the third part of the map. Use the F key to uncollapse everything. And submit your map. How are we going to submit our map? You are going to go to File, Publish, Start, Publish for 6 months. Now there are little file folder things. Click Send Links. Go to Web Page, and I'm using a Mac, so I'm doing Command C, whatever you got to do to copy this, and submit this link. I'm going to stick it somewhere where I won't forget what it is. For myself, maybe you do the same thing. Submit that link. That is how you submit your map. Last thing, let's briefly talk about writing paper 1A. Hopefully you've already done the introduction to paper 1A tutorial in Canvas, so you know what to expect. You know this is an atypical assignment where you are going to pretend to be Sarah Joyner. We're going to treat the podcast like it was just a conversation you had with a friend, you're shooting some ideas around, and now it's time to write your paper and you have to write them actually down. Imagine that instead of trying to summarize the podcast or present the argument from the podcast, you're trying to present the argument from the map, right? Our boiled down version of the argument. This is what you're trying to communicate in your paper. And as we saw in our first short paragraph writing assignment, you can communicate one and the same argument, what's captured in the map, in more than one way in writing. You can put the arguments in different orders. You can connect them in different ways, explain them in different ways. That's your real task for this paper. Soon you're going to complete 2 writing tutorials, one on writing intro paragraphs and one on paragraphing more generally. Those are the main writing skills we're going to practice in this paper. So something I want you to briefly think about is how is communicating this argument in a traditional academic essay, like you're going to write for this class and like maybe you've written in other classes. How is communicating an argument in a traditional academic essay different from communicating it in other contexts? For example, a podcast episode that is meant to be as much entertainment as informative, or for thinking about food and its relationship to us, as maybe is the goal of the podcast. What are some choices that you would make differently from Joyner and Bridget Lancaster in the podcast for the purposes of writing a paper? What things will you cut? What things were included for entertainment value What things would you add or clarify? What organizational choices would you do differently? Start thinking about how the context shapes the writing choices that you're making. Okay, I look forward to seeing what everyone does with this paper, and hopefully people will do some fairly different things with it, even though we're all working with the same argument as represented in our map.